There's a moment that comes for almost everyone, usually somewhere in a quiet kitchen or hospital waiting room or the backseat of a car driving home from a funeral, when a person realizes that the life they have been living was never a rehearsal. It was the whole show. Nobody warned them. Nobody sat them down at 25 or 35 or even 50 and said, "Here's what you will wish you had known sooner." Instead, the truth arrives late, usually after 70 years of living, wrapped in regret, and delivered quietly, almost apologetically, as if it is embarrassed to be so obvious now that it is too late to change much of anything. This is the story of those truths. Not abstract philosophy, not motivational poster wisdom, but the raw, uncomfortable lessons that people in their 70s and 80s and 90s consistently say they wish someone had told them decades earlier. Stick around, because lesson number 7 is the one that nurses and caregivers say breaks people the most, and lesson 11 might change how you spend your evening tonight. The first truth is that time does not feel the way it looks on a calendar. When you are young, a year feels like a vast, almost endless stretch of days. By the time a person reaches 70, a year can feel like it passed in the time it takes to boil an egg. Researchers who study the psychology of time perception have long pointed out that our sense of time speeds up as we age, partly because each year becomes a smaller fraction of our total life experience, and partly because routine compresses memory. A year full of new experiences feels long in memory. A year of sameness evaporates. People in their 70s often describe entire decades, especially the ones spent on autopilot at a job or in a routine that never changed, as a blur. The lesson they wish they had learned sooner is that novelty is not a luxury. It is what makes a life feel long while you are living it, and full when you look back on it. The second truth is that most people do not regret the failures. They regret the things they never tried. This idea has shown up again and again in interviews, surveys, and long-term studies of older adults reflecting on their lives. The failed business, the awkward first date, the embarrassing mistake at work, these things fade. What lingers, decades later, is the manuscript never finished, the person never told how they felt, the trip never taken because the timing never seemed right. A 70-year-old person does not lie awake at night replaying the time they tried and lost. They lie awake replaying the time they wanted to try and did not. What makes this particular regret so heavy is that it rarely announces itself early. At 30, the unfinished project or the unspoken feeling seems like something that can be revisited later, once things settle down, once there's more time or more money or more courage. But later has a way of quietly becoming never. Decade after decade slips by while the door that once stood open narrows a little more each year, until one day a person realizes the opportunity is not merely delayed, it is gone. The lesson is simple and brutal at the same time. Fear of failure costs far less than the silence of never trying at all. The third truth is that health is not a background detail of life. It is the main character, and most people only realize this once it starts slipping away. In your 20s and 30s, energy feels infinite. You can skip sleep, eat poorly, ignore your body for years, and it mostly forgives you. By 70, the body keeps a detailed account, and it presents the bill without warning. People who reach their 70s in strong physical condition consistently say the same thing. They started paying attention decades earlier, not because they were vain, but because they understood something younger people rarely do, which is that the version of you at 70 is built entirely out of the choices made by the version of you at 30 and 40 and 50. This does not mean chasing perfection or punishing the body with extreme routines. The people who age the most gracefully usually describe something far more modest, a habit of moving daily, sleeping consistently, eating reasonably, and treating checkups as non-negotiable rather than optional. They talk about small joints and simple movements the way younger people talk about retirement accounts, as something that compounds quietly over time and either rewards patience or punishes neglect. The body, it turns out, is the one possession nobody can replace, and yet it is often the one most people take for granted the longest. The fourth truth is that relationships, not achievements, are what people count when they take stock of a life. Career titles, awards, houses, cars, none of these show up in the stories people tell in their final decades unless those things are attached to a person they loved. What they talk about instead is the friend who showed up during a divorce, the sibling they stopped speaking to over something that, decades later, feels impossibly small, the parent they wish they had called more. Long-term research on aging and life satisfaction has repeatedly found that the depth and quality of close relationships predicts happiness and even physical health far more reliably than income or professional success. The tragedy is that this truth is almost always learned only after most of the relevant relationships have already been shaped by decades of neglect or effort. There is a particular kind of quiet heartbreak that shows up in this stage of life, the realization that a relationship could have been repaired years earlier with a single honest conversation, if only pride had not gotten in the way. Many people in their 70s describe reconciliations that came only after illness or loss forced the issue, and just as many describe reconciliations that never came at all because someone waited too long. The people who seem most at peace in old age are almost always the ones who stopped waiting for the perfect moment to reach out, and simply reached out anyway. The fifth truth is one of the hardest to hear while young enough to act on it. Nobody is coming to save you from the consequences of your own habits. Not your future self, not a lucky break, not a sudden burst of motivation. The people who reach 70 in good financial shape almost universally point to boring, unglamorous habits practiced consistently over 40 or 50 years, not to a single dramatic decision. The people who reach 70 in financial hardship often point to the same handful of small choices repeated for decades, spending slightly more than they earned, avoiding a difficult conversation about money, believing tomorrow would somehow be easier than today. The lesson is not complicated. It is simply unpopular, because it requires discipline in your 20s for a payoff you will not fully appreciate until your 70s. The sixth truth is that comparison quietly steals decades from people who never even notice it happening. In your youth, comparing yourself to peers, neighbors, and even strangers online feels normal, even productive. By the time people reach their 70s, almost none of them care anymore who had the bigger house or the flashier car or the more impressive job title. What they care about is whether they lived according to their own values. Many describe a specific and painful realization, sometimes arriving as late as their 60s, that they spent enormous energy chasing a version of success that was never actually theirs to begin with. It belonged to someone else's expectations, a parent, a community, a culture obsessed with visible markers of achievement. Letting go of comparison, they say, felt less like giving up and more like finally putting down a heavy bag they had been carrying without noticing. Once the comparison faded, what replaced it was something closer to curiosity, a genuine interest in their own preferences and pace, unfiltered by the question of how it looked to anyone else. This shift, when it happens early enough in life, frees up decades of energy that would otherwise be spent performing for an audience that was never really watching as closely as it seemed. The seventh truth is the one caregivers and hospice workers mention most often, and it is this. People do not fear death nearly as much as they fear an unlived life. The specific regret that surfaces again and again in their final years is some version of the same sentence. I wish I had let myself be who I actually was, instead of who I thought I was supposed to be. This shows up in career choices abandoned to please a parent, passions set aside because they seemed impractical, entire personalities suppressed to keep the peace in a marriage or family. The seventh lesson, delivered decades too late for many, is that authenticity is not a self-indulgent luxury. It is the difference between a life that feels lived and one that simply happened to someone. The eighth truth is that gratitude is not a mood. It is a skill, and most people never practice it until they are forced to by loss. Ask someone who has survived a serious illness what changed about how they see an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and you will hear something close to reverence. The sunlight through a window, a phone call from a friend, a cup of coffee that tastes exactly the way it should. People in their 70s who report the highest life satisfaction are rarely the ones with the most. They are the ones who trained themselves, often the hard way, to notice what they already had instead of endlessly reaching for what they did not. Some describe keeping a simple nightly habit of naming 3 good things from the day. Nothing dramatic, just a warm meal or a kind word from a stranger or a good night's sleep. Over years, this small practice reshaped how they experienced entire decades, not by changing their circumstances but by changing what they paid attention to within those circumstances. Gratitude, practiced this way, becomes less about optimism and more about accuracy. A more honest accounting of a life that was never as empty as anxiety made it feel in the moment. The ninth truth is that most fears people carry for decades never actually happen, and the ones that do happen are almost always survivable in ways the person could not have imagined in advance. Ask a 70-year-old about the thing they were most afraid of at 30, and there's a good chance either it never occurred, or it occurred and they lived through it anyway. often becoming stronger in the process. Anxiety about the future, while completely human, consumes years of present tense living in exchange for a threat that frequently never materializes. The ninth lesson is that worry is rarely a useful form of preparation. It is simply suffering paid in advance for a debt that may never come due. The 10th truth is that forgiveness, especially of yourself, is not optional if you want peace in old age. Grudges held for decades, whether against a parent, an ex-partner, or against your own younger self for mistakes made long ago, do not protect a person. They corrode them slowly, quietly, from the inside. People who reach their 70s with a sense of peace almost universally describe a moment, sometimes just one conversation or one private decision, where they chose to release a resentment they had carried for years. Not because the other person deserved it, but because they themselves deserved to stop carrying it. Self-forgiveness in particular tends to arrive latest of all, often only after decades of quietly punishing oneself for a decision made when they were younger, less informed, and doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. The people who finally extend themselves that same grace they would offer a friend describe it as one of the most freeing moments of their entire lives, and many wish they had found that grace 40 years sooner instead of near the very end. The 11th truth, and perhaps the most immediately useful one, is that the small rituals of an ordinary evening matter more than almost anyone realizes while they are young. The shared dinner, the short walk, the phone call to a parent, the 10 minutes of reading before bed. These tiny repeated acts are what actually accumulate into a life well lived. Grand gestures are rare and memorable, but it is the quiet repetition of small good choices that builds a foundation strong enough to hold a person up when the harder decades arrive. The 12th truth, and the one that ties all the others together, is that meaning does not arrive automatically with age. It is to be built deliberately, decade by decade, out of the choices described above, choosing connection over comparison, honesty over performance, gratitude over grasping, forgiveness over resentment, and presence over distraction. Nobody reaches 70 and receives wisdom as a gift for simply surviving that long. The people who arrive at that age with genuine peace are the ones who spent the previous 50 years quietly practicing these lessons long before anyone told them why they mattered. What makes these 12 truths so painful is not that they are complicated or hard to understand. Almost anyone hearing them for the first time will nod along, recognizing something they already suspected deep down. What makes them painful is timing. They tend to arrive fully formed only after most of the decades available to act on them have already passed, leaving behind a strange mixture of clarity and grief. The sense of finally understanding the instructions only after the test is nearly over. And yet, for anyone hearing this now, still with years or decades ahead of them, that timing problem has a solution, and it is simply to start early. If there is one piece of advice to take from all 12 of these truths, it is this. You do not have to wait until you are 70 to start living as though these lessons are already true. Call the person you have been meaning to call. Start the project you have been postponing. Forgive the grudge that is only hurting you. Move your body today, not for how it looks but for the decades it will need to carry you. Notice the ordinary Tuesday you are currently living through, because someday, someone who is 70 years old will tell you, with complete sincerity, that an ordinary Tuesday was worth more than they ever understood at the time. The truth about these lessons is that they are not really secrets. They have been said before, in different words, by different generations, in different corners of the world. What keeps them from sinking in is not a lack of information. It is a lack of urgency, the quiet assumption that there will always be more time to apply them later. But later is not guaranteed for anyone, at any age. And the people who understood that earliest are almost always the ones who describe their lives, even with all the ordinary hardship built into any long life, as ones they would happily live all over again. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. If this story moved you even a little, or made you think differently about the life you are building right now, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next one. Leave a comment and let us know which of these 12 truths hit you the hardest. We genuinely read every single one. Take care of yourself, be kind to the people around you, and we will see you again very soon.